Knights of the Nine. Oblivion's first major DLC that most of its players will have actually played. A massive hole that was left in the design of Cyrodiil was in its religious core. Despite being the home of the Chapel of the Nine Divines, very little of the base game's story has anything to do with the Adrix side of the Pantheon. You'll just have to notice that each of Cyrodiil's 9 major cities corresponds to a different Adra, or you'll have to explore the otherwise empty Arboretum and notice all the statues. This is kind of obviously a problem, since if there was any game where it was appropriate to actually explore the Imperial religion, culture, and history, this was the game. However, fans at the time were concerned about whether Bethesda was even going to make an expansion to Oblivion, seeing as they seemed content to just release the official plugins for sale. Still, Knights of the Nine would come out by the end of 2006, first being accidentally leaked as a PS3 exclusive questline called Knights of the White Stallion. So how is Knights of the Nine? Well, it's an 11-part quest series, making it shorter than most of the factions in the game, and I went from beginning to end in just over 3.5 hours, falling a little short of the 20 hours of content promised. Despite those massive limitations, arguably Knights of the Nine is a highlight of the Oblivion experience. However, I don't think it fares as favorably on the quality versus quantity spectrum as people like to think. Like most Elder Scrolls expansions, Knights of the Nine has a rough start. I guess it could be seen as a product of the times. Personally, I think they should have learned from Tribunal and Blood Moon, or any of the DLC released leading up to now, that assuming people of the future playing the game aren't just going to have the expansions installed from the get-go is a mistake. This more so applies to the plugins, however. Regardless, things start when we hear a rumor that the Chapel of Dibella in Anvil was attacked.
Are you here to end this nightmare and free us all from the savage garden? Everyone here died in the Master's service. As the Master promised, we are now immortal. But our life here is a nightmare. The creatures of the garden torment us endlessly. When they kill us, we are soon reborn, and the cycle begins again. He preaches in Anvil. Appeared right after the attack on the chapel there. Sounds like the usual doom-saying nonsense.
Anvil also has a new homeless man going by the name Prophet, claiming that this is a sign of the end times, so really nothing new. We're supposed to figure out that the rambling insane man is in fact the key to starting the questline, our clue being his unique voice. He'll establish the ones responsible as Umaril and his gaggle of Aurorans. The Prophet then says that Umaril can only be stopped with the aid of the Divines, and that means the Crusaders' relics. If we say we're going to get the relics, the Prophet will ask for our resume, which is actually a trap, as Wes Johnson will demean you for every response other than humility.
And never let anyone forget it, champion. I salute you, yes. This small matter of the Crusaders' relics should be a trifle for a legend such as yourself. I apologize for even asking the question. Most esteemed master, please. Do not allow me to interrupt your quest for the relics. Oh my! The grand champion of all Cyrodiil? Bayazera, 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 indeed. Surely there can be no better preparation for becoming a holy knight than a career spent slaughtering for the public's entertainment. And a worthy successor to Hannibal Traven, I have no doubt. I'm sure your arcane arts will locate the lost relics for you in no time. Well then, hail, hero of Kvatch! Let me add one more voice to the never-ending chorus of praise. I'm sure one of your many devotees will be able to guide you on your way to find the Crusaders' relics. And I'm sure you will have no trouble finding the relics on your own. You clearly need no aid from man or God. Why do you come to me for aid, worthy knight?
I know what the quest is trying to do here, I just feel that not making it possible to complete this quest without the submission part is cheap. Once we eat the Prophet's ass, he's willing to point us in the right direction, telling us to complete a pilgrimage to Way Shrines of the Nine Divines. This is obviously a recreation of the quest Pilgrimage of the Seven Graces from the Tribunal Temple questline in Morrowind. The difference is that the Seven Graces were 7 fixed locations that shared various lessons in the lore and culture of the Tribunal Temple. The Way Shrines are generic, exist in multiples without any actual rhyme or reason to their locations, and only spout generic platitudes. It's possible this is a hereditary problem, and that Bethesda may have had issues with revamping the base game Way Shrines for existing saves that already had their effects and variables stored. As it stands, the only thing to spice this quest up is potentially running into a couple guys who are doing the pilgrimage. I didn't, because I had already gotten 6 of the way shrines in my adventure prior to starting this quest. If you visit all the shrines, and also very importantly call the Prophet Daddy, then you'll be approached by the specter of Pelinal Whitestrake. Unsurprisingly, a guy who died in the First Age has zero idea where his armor is millennia later and can only point us towards a shrine built on the site of his death. Since it's in a submerged Iliad city, the shrine is untouched, although centuries ago one Sir Amiel managed to almost reach the shrine. It's surprising that despite the criticism, Knights of the Nine is still willing to throw us into an Iliad ruin/Imperial sewer area full of the undead. Also, if you have high acrobatics, you can just pop the fence. It's pretty cool. This is also the point where the game decides whether you receive the light or heavy version of the armor. I didn't know this was a thing. I always just assumed the game would trust the player to play content called the Knights of the Nine as, well, a knight character. I mean, I understand not wanting to exclude players, but I think having slightly worse stats is preferable to variable armor weights. Or maybe his gear could be some kind of in-between of heavy and light. Is there a word for that? With the usual Elder Scrolls skill crunch, Oblivion decided to cut medium armor and unarmored. Unarmored is still in the game though, encouraged by spell effectiveness. Honestly, I think the skill crunch is stupid, and cutting unarmored despite keeping its mechanics and incentives in the game is asinine. Monks have been in fantasy forever, so I don't understand why we're cutting the core skills of their class. Medium armor, on the other hand, has been cut entirely. Different armor types filled the niche in Morrowind of providing the player with countless options for how they approach designing their character. You could range from going naked to just running light bracers or a shoulder pad to full Daedric armor. The difference was all in your encumbrance. Less armor might mean an extra weapon or potions or more loot on the way back. How much gear you wore, or what combination of gear you wore, was a decision each player had to make in crafting their character. Oblivion changed things up by encouraging players to commit to an armor style. If you wear light armor, you might as well wear full light armor. Same with heavy armor, or unarmed. The first 3 perks, or up to level 50 with armor skills, affect how quickly your armor degrades. We'll talk about durability in a bit. The 75 and 100 perks affect how much the armor weighs the player down. At Heavy Armor 100, which I reached, Heavy Armor had 0 impact on my encumbrance as long as I was wearing it. While I feel like this is a smart way of sidestepping the late game encumbrance issues, encumbrance has become an increasingly prevalent problem in the series, including the Fallout games. People don't like encumbrance because they don't like being told that they can't pick up everything, which isn't helped with the games increasingly encouraging you to pick up random trash that serves obscure purposes. Honestly, I think this is a UI problem. I was attentive and made sure I was routinely cleaning my inventory out of useless soul gems, potions, scrolls, and ingredients. But people who aren't as attentive are probably accumulating an increasing hoard of potions they then try to avoid using. And I think it's because it's easy to not realize how many you have with the newer user interfaces. Wow, this section's Tangent City. Point is, encumbrance has been shifted away from regulating how much equipment the player can carry to how much loot the player can carry, which would be understandably frustrating if Oblivion's economy didn't break at level 20. Still, it turns into a genetic problem for the series when you cut out the magical solutions to high encumbrance. Sure, being able to permanently boost your carry weight with Feather on the cheap was busted in Oblivion, and the design should be more so towards adding an additional weight for a short time so you can take all the loot home in one trip, but that's not grounds to give up on the spell idea entirely. But I do think I am onto something with this UI idea. You can only see 6 things at any given time in the Oblivion UI, and with the large number of potion types and sublevels of potion types plus custom potions, it's pretty easy to realize you've accidentally been carrying a frost resistance potion for the last 6 hours. Part of it is a lack of variation, and potion design makes it so you can't tell which potions you do and don't want. Morrowind had 5 different models and icons to distinguish potions, so you could easily tell what was probably cheap garbage and what was worth keeping. Skyrim addressed that problem by removing item icons entirely, although at least in fairness I can see more than 6 things at once in Skyrim's menu. That UI is for another day. For now, let's go tab by tab and discuss the Oblivion user interface. There is no more or less information to be gleaned from the Oblivion UI compared to its Morrowind predecessor. However, Morrowind had 2 different user interfaces. This godly PC user interface, and a panel-based version on the Xbox. Oblivion inherited the panel-based design, which is fine, I guess. I would prefer my old system of pressing one button and having all the information I need on one screen, but dividing this into 4 separate screens to relay more information is fine as well. Except it doesn't. You can see your entire attribute and skill alignment, as well as detailed health, magicka, and fatigue values. with enough screen space to spare to waste on telling us our name and class. If we scroll the skills down, we can see our faction and ranks as well as our reputation and bounty. That's 4 different Oblivion screens in one panel. Oblivion's first panel tells us our base character information. The only reason to come here is if you've loaded someone else's save or want specific information about exactly how much health, magicka, or fatigue you have. The next panel is entirely dedicated to the attribute page. There are 2 reasons to come here. You want to know what skills are under what attributes, or you want to see if your attributes are damaged. The next screen is the skill page. The smartest thing about this page is putting all the major skills on a single panel. This is one of the more useful panels you'll be coming back to, as it tells you the leveling progress of skills and what skills belong to what attributes, so very useful. The next page tells you what factions you're in and what ranks you are. However, since rank requirements were removed, this is pointless information, and there's no reason you wouldn't put this at the bottom of the same page where our name and class is, because the only reason you'll come here again is if you're loading someone else's save and need to see where they're at.
The most useful information on the stats page is how many times you've trained and your bounty, and maybe your fame rating.
The next page is the bulk of new information, which is the statistics page. The first section is useful information like days passed and the number of quests you've completed. Then there's this section about your skills that I really don't need to know about, and then at the bottom of this is your bounty, fame, and infamy. This would all fit neatly, except the Shivering Isles has an independent bounty, which means you have to scroll to see infamy now. It was so close and the expansion messed it up. The rest of the page is statistical information that 100%ers use to track their progress. It's for somebody, so it's fine. Next is the inventory screen, which wastes the first tab on an all items panel. Stop right there, UI scum. If you're only going to show me 6 things at once like the other screens do, then this is pointless. Here was the chance to zoom this panel out so we could get a bird's eye view on our inventory, and the individual tabs would be in the big text. Either cut this panel or rescale this text. Next is the weapons tab, then the armor tab, then the potions and ingredients tab, and then everything else is shoved into the right. Okay, cut the all tab and add a section specifically for scrolls, soul gems, sigil stones, and welkin stones, please. There's way too much stuff in this tab, especially compared to the weapons tab that could have just been combined with the armor tab because a lot of people just hotkey their weapons anyways. Whose great idea was it to have me scroll through all these keys just to get to the soul gems? Next is the magic tab. We have another useless all spells tab that only shows you 6 spells. Skyrim added a favorite system that would fit in better here since I have way too many spells to scroll through. The tabs are divided into how they're applied, so a target tab, a touch tab, and a self tab. Spells can then be divided into either alphabetical order or by magicka cost, and pro tip, use letters at the start of your custom spell names in order to organize them because otherwise this menu will turn into a mess. Between this and the miscellaneous tab, I have a feeling I know the UX designer really doesn't use magic. The final tab is your active effects section. Also, spell effectiveness is just tucked into the bottom of the screen here, just peeking out for you. Since an armor doesn't have a skill, I guess it has nowhere else to go, so yeah, homeless user interface elements. This UI is also wasting a lot of potential screen space for the benefit of showing the player character's goofy expressions at all times, except on the info tab. In other words, we could have had an intelligent usage of the entire screen, with a button on the inventory to glance at our character, and they even went so far as to use that idea, but not for the tabs that really need it. The final tab is for information, starting with the local map. You can't zoom, so you have to scroll this lumbering beast around to actually use this thing in dungeons. Otherwise, I approve. I'm torn on whether Oblivion or Morrowind had a better auto map. Next is the world map screen, and boy does not being able to zoom out make me angry. I'm sure you probably could at some point during development and somebody used the command to unlock all waypoints and the map turned into a mess, so that's why we can't zoom out. It's just so claustrophobic. The best backhanded compliment I can give is that it encourages people to learn the map so they don't have to take so long scrolling around looking for their objective. One problem is that Oblivion's map does a bad job communicating elevation to the player, so you can't look at the map and come up with an intelligent plan to navigate mountainous terrain because all the map tells you is that the area is mountainous. Also, at the top is the name of the interior cell and a detailed breakdown of the date and time in case you were curious. I've never understood displaying the time in a UI that's paused. Surely it would be for an unpaused UI so the player could pay attention to what time it is in game. The next panel is the Active Quest tab, which includes a handy list of all your relevant journal entries and a button to take you straight to the map marker on the world map. Then we have the Current Quest tab, which lists all of the quests you weren't able to say no to before they got added to your log. And finally, you have the Completed Quest tab, which shows you every single quest you've completed. Naturally. You can even read old journal entries here if you want, although it's a shadow of the old book UI for the journal with its topic organizer. I've trashed this UI, and a lot of people do, which begs the question of who okayed it, and the answer seems to be Todd Howard. Specifically, when asked about what mods Todd uses for Oblivion, he answered, interface mods. He goes on to talk about how they couldn't work out a good system for giving the player the choice between a PC and console-scaled UI, so they went with this giant user interface for safety reasons. Here's your executive producer saying this is a problem as he's advertising the expansion to this game, as he's saying someone's already fixed it for free, and they've clearly tinkered with the UI to accommodate that expansion, hint hint, and they didn't try to fix it. Like what? Was a toggle button impossible? I know it took years of begging to implement a field of view slider, but come on. Alright, let's turn this around with some praise. Credit goes to Natalia Smirnova. I think your user interface art looks great. I can easily tell what each tab is supposed to be just from the pictograph, like how all the quests are 3 cups, the current quest is 1 cup, and the active quest has a hand holding the cup. Oblivion has a pretty clear and consistent visual design focus, similar to how Skyrim has a consistent design with minimalism. Don't let people criticizing the UX get you down. They just don't get that you were handed an interface and told to make it look good. It's very obvious you know what you're doing, and it's your boss's fault that you aren't allowed to design amazing PC interfaces as well. Remember when I promised we'd talk about durability for what, the 3rd time? So when I made the Morrowind video, that came with a somewhat controversial section about durability mechanics and intentional annoyances, and I've come to see the light. I still believe my original position. No, the light I've seen is why people were annoyed by this mechanic. It's fine in Morrowind, but I think a lot of people arguing against my point were doing so from the perspective of never having played Morrowind, and so we're imagining Oblivion where it's busted. Oblivion's armor skills would add these perks related to the way armor degrades in quality. Novices break their gear 50% faster, apprentices break it at quote normal rate end quote, and journeymen break it 50% slower. So when you start the game, your gear starts breaking faster than it did in Morrowind. Then you have the Armorer perk, which themselves start limiting the player. So novices and apprentices in Armorer can't repair magic gear, so if you have enchanted armor, you have to go to a services provider, which can be a pain because it means if all your gear is enchanted, you can't train Armorer in the field anymore. And then you add on top of this that as the player levels, they gain access to new item sets which themselves see increases in their total durability. Oh, and armor and weapon stats are tied to durability. A sword at 90% does 90% of its normal damage rating. All of these factors mean that early game Oblivion is going to involve a bunch of broken armor, while late game Oblivion just forgets about the mechanic. I think this system has left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths, which is significant if Oblivion was your first role-playing game back on the 360. What's funny is that Armorer level 75 is actually brilliant. At this level, you can actually repair your gear up to 125% durability, which increases its effectiveness. But okay, why should games keep annoying mechanics like durability around? It's a relic of the past with no place in the modern industry. You're being had. As I pointed out, there's not much of a difference between a hunger meter and a durability meter. Both are obstacles the player has to overcome with routine, preventative maintenance. Both are mechanics the player has to plan around during play. I'm sorry, but explain to me how it's unacceptable for modern RPGs to have durability mechanics, but it's fine when survival games do exactly the same thing. Sometimes even with actual equipment durability. 6 million people bought Valheim and were clearly fine with playing a game with equipment durability and hunger. It's one thing to see equipment upkeep as annoying, it's another thing to be happy at its removal because it annoys you. These people are actively celebrating the oversimplification of their games because they refuse to acknowledge the mechanical and emergent storytelling benefits of equipment durability. And I suspect they do that because they were emotionally annoyed at the one time they forgot to repair their stuff and had to suffer consequences for it. After all, durability mechanics form a negative feedback loop. You're implicitly biased towards remembering all the times you were annoyed by the system, and most people don't recognize the benefits as a result. But what possible benefit could there be? Scenario: your weapon breaks, what do you do? If the answer is load a save back in town and redo the trip, this time with repaired gear, you're a pleb. Video games are too complex for you, go back to movies. The correct answer is adapt. If you didn't bring a backup weapon and are completely incapable of using fists or magic, find a new weapon. Retreat to a prior enemy who wielded a sword, or grab one of numerous spare weapons that dot dungeons. Did you think they were there just for aesthetics? It might be tough, but I'm sure you'll remember to keep your gear in good shape in the future. As a result, you'll be a better player, one whose character is actually forged by experience. A weapon breaking on its wielder is pretty dangerous. Do you know what else is dangerous? Archers running out of arrows. Should ammo be infinite to avoid the annoying mechanics of keeping track of your ammo supply? Should potions be infinite because it's inconvenient to get more and running out in a fight is dangerous? You might say that this hypothetical is absurd, except there are plenty of series which removed getting arrows for your bows in favor of having infinite ammo, or even keeping a supply of potions ready in favor of an infinite potion on cooldown. It's more likely than you think. Where do you draw the line? Are you going to celebrate when Elder Scrolls 6 doesn't have arrows or potions anymore? Where the Morrowind argument really started to get stupid was people saying that my logic was flawed because a CRPG with a focus on the minutiae of adventure focuses on the minutiae of adventure. It's somewhat disturbing the number of people who came to the nudist colony and then started complaining about how everyone isn't wearing clothes. Look, I get it's subjective, and you don't like it, which is why you play games that cater to your specific interests, and I play games that cater to mine. Where we have a problem is when you start demanding that my games change to suit your interests. I've never looked at a Call of Duty game and said, this is fine and all, but what this really needs is hardcore military simulation. Call of Duty fills a niche. It's an action title. It's remarkably simple because that's what the audience wants from it, to not have to think about it. I would change it, but at its core, my Call of Duty game is still an action title. Just like I would add prostitutes to truck sims, but not take away the truck driving part of the game to focus on the bisexual road trip aspects. However, unlike Call of Duty or truck driving sims, there aren't a lot of games purely like Morrowind. It's a niche. So when one of the few companies catering to that niche starts changing aspects of the formula to broaden the appeal by shaving off the edges, it stops being the original niche. It happened to the Daggerfall fans. It happened to the Morrowind fans. It even happened to the Oblivion fans, and it'll likely happen to the Skyrim fans. Not because any of our expectations were unrealistic, all we wanted was the same thing with less flaws, but because it was determined that not using the new accessibility features was adequate for the old fans, and finding mods to re-implement the old mechanics that were cut was an adequate answer to the old fans.
The other thing I try to do is that in coming off of Thief, which is a game all about stealth and sneaking, so it was like, how could I get some of that into Oblivion, some of that, how to try to capture a little bit of the charm of the Thief games. It occurred to me, I'm like, shortly after the game is released, the mod community is gonna do what they will. And sure enough, there's like a complete like Thief plugin with all of Garrett's tools from Thief, you know what I mean? Like water arrows and moss arrows and the blackjack and all this stuff. So I sort of knew that was gonna, I was like, this is gonna happen anyway.
That's Emil Pagliarulo, a current lead designer at Bethesda, admitting that he has no problem with leaving it up to the community to add features to their games. Sir Emil's journal points out a priory where his order was based, which was centered around collecting the armor of Pelennor Whitestrake. This order was the titular Knights of the Nine. Using a ring we honorably looted off of Sir Emil's corpse reveals a hidden undercroft, and we're confronted by both the spirit of Sir Emil as well as 7 of his buddies who proceed to try and kick our ass. Technically, it's a test of worthiness, although I don't know if a guy wielding a quarter of the Daedric Pantheon's artifacts is worthy or just good at exercising with ghosts. It's actually a pretty cool sequence, barring the line,
Sir Knight, in 300 years, none have stood against us and lived.
How could I possibly not be the first person in 300 years to come down here? Getting here required a signet ring off your corpse, buddy. Also, ignore the fact that we're already a third of the way through the content. We're the Knight Commander of this order now and have acquired the helm and cuirass of the Crusader. 4 of the ghosts will start quests to find the other artifacts, but all 8 have some interesting information about the history of the Knights. As an order, their goal was to locate and safeguard the relics of Pelennor Whitestrake. Surprisingly, despite being over 1,000 years late, they managed to recover most of the artifacts, but their fall would come when they began increasingly wearing them. Then the War of the Red Diamond happened, and the Order lost Sir Beric, who took 2 of the artifacts with him to Skyrim to fight in the war. Our job now is to travel Cyrodiil to piece together and fix the long-dead issues of the Order. Let's take a detour and discuss the soundtrack. Oblivion sees the return of Jeremy Soule, well-known video game composer who's worked on dozens of games over the years. His career becomes even more impressive considering how many scores he composed in just 25 years, scoring 8 different games to come out the same year as Morrowind, and 4 different games and 4 expansions to come out the same year as Oblivion. The number of jobs Soule took on slowed down in the 2010s, so he got more time to compose for Skyrim, hence why it has the biggest and arguably best soundtrack of the series. Not a lot has changed about how music works between Morrowind and Oblivion. Tracks are still divided between exploration and battle themes, which are played in their respective contexts. Start a fight, and the music immediately changes to a battle theme. End the fight, and the music immediately changes back to an explore theme. Oblivion would, however, add 2 additional modes for music, one for towns and one for dungeons. So now, instead of hearing chirpy tunes and dank caves, music's more appropriate for the situation. It's still simple compared to modern music techniques in games, but this small change helps the atmosphere of dungeons quite a bit. Let's get into the tracks proper, most of which you'll have heard by now in the video. Oblivion's title theme draws heavily from Morrowind. Those uninformed in the topic of music took this as an insult when I showed how Skyrim incorporated themes from Morrowind, so allow me to explain how motifs work. Motifs are simple parts of music which provide part of the basic identity of the song you're listening to. For Elder Scrolls, this is a recurring motif. This musical idea is present in each iteration of the theme, not because Soul is stealing from himself, but because that's how composition works. Oblivion's theme is more bombastic than Morrowind's, however. Its highs are higher, but it also has lows. This single 2-minute song captures the essence of the Oblivion soundtrack by touching all 4 corners. The other 2 special tracks are for leveling up and dying, exactly like Morrowind. Alright, let's do the town tracks. Here's some snippets from all 5 of them to give you a feel for what town music sounds like. An idea reiterated upon from Morrowind is the idea that the comm tracks are not defined by percussion. I feel if anything has contributed the most to the mimetic element of NPCs in Oblivion, it's the immediately recognizable music that most people instantly associate with NPC hubs. On to the atmospheric tracks, which play when exploring. There are 7 of these, and here's a montage. Many people discussing this soundtrack comment on a car accident Jeremy Soule was involved in that informed the soundtrack of Oblivion. What they often leave out is that a third of the soundtrack had already been composed for the game, or that there were few revisions to the soundtrack. Jeremy Soule didn't just knock it out of the park, but wrote 2/3 of the soundtrack just from emotion he felt without any need or desire for revision. A thing I noticed is that because the load has been lightened, tracks don't have to cover as much ground as they did in Morrowind. A Morrowind ambient track had to cover towns, wilderness, and caves. It's easy for me to listen to this soundtrack because, thanks to its increased length, there's more variety. Speaking of caves, the new dungeon tracks. Oblivion's dungeons seem to be defined by long, dissonant notes. The notes sit so long as to be unnerving until a roll of timpanis in the background reminds you that you're still trapped inside the earth. While over half the soundtrack is dedicated to town and exploration tracks, there are only 7.5 minutes of dungeon themes, and the similarity does lead to repetition in this respect. Is it possible part of the reason dungeons feel repetitive in Oblivion is the music? It's more likely than you think. Your brain pays attention to this kind of stuff. Finally, there are the battle tracks. I think it's fair to say I know which third of the soundtrack Jeremy Soule had written before the accident. One thing I did note in the Morrowind soundtrack was that brass seemed to be the theme for the Imperials while strings seemed to be for the Dunmer. This dichotomy has shifted into brass being the sound of battle and strings being the sound of peace. One idea that I posited was that Soule didn't really care about the Morrowind soundtrack, as evidenced by the original titles versus the remastered titles after the game was successful. This is more likely than people seem to realize. Soule had worked on the Dungeon Siege and Neverwinter Nights soundtracks the same year as Morrowind, and while he did work on a lot of projects at the same time as Oblivion, his output seemed to slow down after the wreck, as though he started wanting to take more pride in the soundtracks he was working on. For Elder Scrolls, this culminated in the Skyrim soundtrack, which is not only longer than the Morrowind and Oblivion soundtracks combined, but is a masterpiece in terms of implementation into gameplay as well.
It has to be acknowledged that it was Obsidian during New Vegas' development alongside Inon Zur that helped lay the groundwork for how the OST implementation changed between Fallout 3 and Skyrim. But Jeremy Soule still played an important role in the soundscape of Skyrim.
Oblivion's dungeons are... well, they simply are. Dungeon crawling is a stated aspect of Elder Scrolls, a consequence of the tabletop translation. The issue is that dungeons are fun with friends at a table, but none of the TES games are cooperative without mods. Thus, the role dungeons have to play in the games requires necessary alteration to better translate them into a single-player experience. How you accomplish this has been a core issue the games have always grappled with. The easy answer is to set quests inside them, but many dungeons have no related quests. They simply are. The Morrowind answer then is to populate dungeons with logical groups of people. Cults, be they Daedric, Sixth House, or Vampiric. Many dungeons are also tied to serving as tombs, full of undead protectors. Even normal bandit dungeons are provided with some ceremony, usually tied to the themes of Vardenfell being a quarantined region with large criminal smuggling operations. In Oblivion, there aren't ancestral tombs, outside of vague reference in one of the Fighters Guild quests. There also aren't many Daedric cults, instead being replaced with generic conjurer groups in blue robes. Maybe those guys should have been Mythic Dawn. Vampire dens are also barely distinguishable from bandit caves. There are only 3 dungeon types that aren't caves: Ayleid Ruins, Abandoned Forts, and Oblivion Gates. The Ayleid Ruins are full of untapped Welkind and Varla stones centuries later, but no records of their civilization. Dwemer Ruins in Morrowind were always full of little mementos of their culture, random gears and cups and tools and armor and books. Ayleid Ruins become interchangeable once you realize the only variation is in the generic enemies you fight, not the stories the areas themselves tell. Abandoned forts are similar. There's no telling the age of each fort based on its design or contents. There were many empires that could have built them, but their cultures do not possess them. Oblivion Gates are not ruins, but their literal repetition, as well as simple characterization, also leads to them being generic. How do you make hell boring? Contrary to popular belief, Oblivion's dungeons were not designed by one guy leaning on copy and paste.
Oblivion did have one level designer for most of its development, but he resigned after making a significant number of dungeons, and it was after that Bethesda then expanded their level design team. So it is simultaneously true that Oblivion's dungeons were largely made by one guy, and that they had multiple level designers.
But it isn't hard for people to perpetuate that legend anyways, because they feel like they were. It makes you wonder whether Bethesda got better at dungeon creation or better at the illusion of good dungeons and what the difference really is. The formula is pretty simple. The player finds an area, they go inside, find out what enemy type the dungeon is, and then either fight or run past all the enemies, looting all the leveled containers before exiting. There's not entirely an incentive to do dungeons for the money because what are you going to spend it on? Training? And the combat is in a state that fighting for the sake of fighting also isn't fun. So the only thing left is the ceremony of doing a dungeon, but dungeons don't have ceremony. Dungeon diving in Oblivion is just doing quests without the context or rewards of doing quests. It's like Daggerfall without the verticality. Quote, "There are plenty of very large dungeons to be sure, and we're trying to provide a higher density of content than we did in Morrowind." On our quest, I start with the boots, which Sir Junkin sought and failed to retrieve. He doesn't have much information to share with us other than the location of a shrine of Kinnereth. This makes her the only of the 9 divines to have a shrine in the wild similar to the Daedric shrines, although it plays into her roles as a divine. We head over to the Kinnereth Worthiness Testing Grotto and get mauled by a giant bear for about 15 seconds before the test is complete. I guess the moral is, if a wild animal attacks you, you just let it happen, because Kinnereth has clearly decided your time has come. This would be fine, except Cyrodiil's roads are littered with critters. She's actually pulling double duty as nature goddess, considering her actual domain is the sky. Anyways, in the grotto are 2 friendly Spriggans and the boots. There's a free point of infamy if you try to fight the Spriggans. Wordlessly, the second we pick up the boots, the Chapel of Breville gets attacked by Aurorans. I always thought this was a weak point in the questline. It's supposed to be an escalation in the conflict and a driver of the tension, but chances are pretty good if the player does end up visiting the chapel before the end of the questline and the NPCs get replaced, they won't exactly know what caused the attack. And if you haven't visited the chapel, you might not even notice all the NPCs are different. And well, even when we do know, there's not a logical line to follow, it's completely arbitrary. Next I went to Leyawiin to get the mace. A guy will greet us at the door telling us that he tried to get the mace and failed and mostly spends his days now protecting the chapel. He does have a pretty big clue for getting the mace, although... See, we pray to the tomb of St. Calidus and get transported to a void that requires the boots to cross. This is because Zenithar is the god of trades and commerce and thereby relies on Kinnereth's new nature motif to function. However, this also means that the Kinnereth quest is a prerequisite to this one, which is a cool idea. The player has a chance to diegetically fail the same way Sir Ralvis did, and let's be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if at least one person threw themselves off the ledge 100 times not understanding what they did wrong. However, against his general motifs, there's actually another way to get the mace.
Telekinesis is so rarely useful.
Once we leave, the Chapel of Dibella is under attack from the Aurorans and we have to fight them off. This can be particularly ugly if it happens to be Sundas morning during the service when they show up. Caridus is a big help though, and he asks to join our order after the battle. Of the original order, Sir Henrik was by far the most successful in that he found a relic, never used it for ill intentions, and then safeguarded it inside a fort which, to this day, has kept the relic safe. A bunch of conjurers have taken over the fort in search of the shield, but the traps and puzzles are just too great for what are generally the smartest type of bandit. There are 3 main puzzles to Fort Bulwark. The first is a pressure plate puzzle involving 4 series of 3 plates that require a specific combination to pass. Okay, less of a puzzle and more of a door code since there isn't any consequence for getting it wrong. The conjurers already figured this one out and placed candles to hint at the solution. The next puzzle is the Guardians. You'll spend hours toiling over setting the right orientations to, just point them at the symbol in the middle.
Phrase kept coming up in the writings I found. When the eyes of the Guardians are upon you, Julianos will show you favor. I'm not sure how, but I just know it's a clue for making it safely through these ruins.
The third puzzle at least has no obvious solution pretending to be a clue. This is Rodgar's equipment puzzle. A pressure plate in the middle will randomly highlight one of the statue's items. Each statue has an item but only shows up one at a time. At the same time, a random item is populated in the central chest. The goal is to match these items to the correct statues. This is only really difficult if you don't get the pen and paper out and just write down what statues correspond to what items, which of course means the conjurers would have starved to death trying to solve this one. Elder Scrolls has always had a complicated relationship with puzzles. A lot of people like to point out the simple matching puzzles of Skyrim, but honestly, that's not much of a simplification over how it's always been. Barring some stuff like the one where you drown yourself in Morrowind or the Blackrock Cave in Oblivion, which isn't a puzzle per se, but is just an obscure abstraction set, Elder Scrolls isn't really known as that puzzling of a game. The reason, I think, comes down to the fact that the designers don't want to stop the flow of a playthrough because someone has a challenging time with a puzzle. And I don't mean this from just an accessibility standpoint. I'm sure we can all think of at least one out-of-place puzzle in a game that did this. Elder Scrolls fits a generalist sort of niche, in that rather than focusing on doing one thing really well, it tries to do a lot of different things. And because this isn't a puzzle game, stopping the player to sit down and cogitate for a bit can be out of place. Then you add on that stipulation that everything has to be possible for the player who plays in 30-minute segments on the couch, and yeah, an incentive exists to not make the puzzles more difficult for the sake of the minority of players who want that. I think the solution looks something like this. Bethesda hires a guy who's good at crafting puzzles. Each Elder Scrolls game could incorporate puzzles, but with a clear design ethos that the only thing you get from them is optional rewards. So the player who knows that challenging puzzles aren't in their wheelhouse can skip them, and players who like completing puzzles can do them. Maybe a few side quests, a couple mages and thieves guild quests, and one main quest would incorporate these challenging puzzles. That way, when you have a quest where the difficulty of the puzzle has been a hindrance to progress, with this quest or the mages guild quest with the pillar, instead of making the characters look like imbeciles for not figuring it out, you could have an appropriately challenging puzzle. Otherwise, you eventually end up with the Blackreach puzzle, you know the one, where you spam the buttons and don't really understand what it is you're trying to solve, but it still has to be there to justify why the Elder Scroll hadn't been already recovered. With the puzzle down, we get our hands on the Shield of the Crusader and leave. I should mention Sir Thedred, but should I really? Regardless of if we meet him or not, he'll come to the Priory and ask to join our order. The excuse given is that we diverted the Conjurer's attention, but even if we stealth through the entire dungeon and steal the shield non-lethally, he still somehow escapes. It's not the biggest deal since stealth playstyles aren't really encouraged to play through Knights of the Nine, except for the fact that the armor will convert itself to light armor and stealth is only tied to infamy via its factions, not its playstyle, and illusion magic is part of the actual knight class. Our final quest for this leg is to get the gloves. Sir Casimir was a knight who went with Sir Barak to war, and this had changed him. He had this to say about the gloves.
I attempted to return to the service of the Nine, but the war had changed me. I no longer had sympathy for the weak or pity for the suffering. In the brief time I was there, I did more to hurt the chapel than help it. It was there that I was cursed. A beggar who came to the chapel each day for help tried my patience one too many times. I lost my temper and struck him. My blow landed harder than I had intended, and he fell to the floor dead, killed in the very chapel of the God of Mercy. I left the chapel at once, of course, but the damage was done. I was weak, constantly weary, and lacked the energy to do almost anything. As proof of the deed, when I struck the poor man, the gauntlets slipped right off my hands and fell to the floor. Heavy as stone, they would not move. None could lift them. I suspect they lie there still, in Coral's chapel.
The setup for this quest is super interesting. The quest itself is not, and super questionable. The gauntlets are, as Casimir says, immovable. One of the priests, Arelder, tells the basic story and mentions that a descendant of Casimir is not only at the church, but has been forced to bear the same curse his ancestor received for his crime. We speak to Kellen, who seems convinced that Arelder's holding out information, as well as,
You've seen them, I assume. The only evidence of what happened so many years ago. Do you know that I thought perhaps I could lift them? That somehow this curse would be lifted if I could pick them up? I tried for hours, until my whole body ached, and I could barely move. I lay there on the floor next to them, weeping. I'm not ashamed to admit that. I've been at the end of my rope for far too long to be ashamed of anything. I've seen plenty of pity in people's eyes over the years. I grew up recognizing it. But with Arelder, there's something else there. And when he speaks to me, there are times I'd swear he sounds apologetic. Guilty, even. Why would that be? What reason does he have to hold back information?
Despite being a quest solely about talking to people, there's some great moments here. Arelder was holding out on Kellen out of selfishness because he knew full well that removing Kellen's curse would entail taking it upon himself. We're then given the objective to do so ourselves. Kellen's enthused, and we're stuck with a damage fatigue effect for 3 quests. Alright, I've been holding back the criticism because I wanted to get the quest over with before we got there. Stendarr, the Divine of Mercy, Justice, and Compassion, is apparently also into generational curses. At this point, not only has it been long enough that the priests don't really know the full story behind the gauntlets, which is odd enough given that someone would have written the story down like that somewhere, but Kellen didn't even know Sir Casimir, considering it would be around 10 generations in his past. This entire family was cursed in order to punish Casimir, just so that one day in the far future, someone could come along on a quest and find some magic hand condoms and have their willingness to show mercy tested. Given how simple the effect is, surely Kellen's family, or the church for that matter, could have scrounged up, what, a petty soul, and asked the Mages Guild for a ring of Fortify Fatigue? I get that Restore Fatigue was lost as an enchant effect after Morrowind, but if DeGale can have a magical widget to treat her condition, then I'm sure Kellen would have gotten something for his chronic fatigue. Never mind that the actual evildoer is being redeemed by proxy, or that there's no option to force Ireldar to actually show the mercy he's supposed to as a priest of Stendarr. Rewrite time. Kellen tries to pick up the gauntlets to take up the mantle of his ancestor Casimir, but gets hit with a fatigue curse as a result. Ireldar's been holding out on the fix for his problem because his father was the guy Casimir killed. He's an elf after all, so it's easily possible. The quest is now about resolving the conflict between these two men. Ireldar has to learn to set aside his personal feelings and do his duty as a healer, and Kellen has to realize that his ancestor wasn't entirely noble and try to right the wrongs of the past. The player has the option to assume the curse, still, but if the player is successful, they can not only redeem both men, but can recruit both into the Order, and can see them develop a friendship as comrades as they overcome their generational grudges. With this leg of the quest done, it's time to return to the Priory with most of the Crusaders' relics. We'll find it's been repaired, and several of the people we've met along the way will ask to join the Knights of the Nine. While I don't see a reason anyone would ever say no, I have to at least appreciate that the player is being given a choice here. We also get a blacksmith, although with the unofficial patch, if the player doesn't speak to Sir Thedret here before this point, the smith doesn't show up. It's a bit comical to enter the Priory to find it full of applicants. Anyways, a man named Lathon approaches us to tell us that Sir Roderick is dead. I didn't actually meet Lathon and Sir Roderick on this playthrough since they appear on the Wayshrine quest and I had done most of them already, so Lathon will tell us that he thinks Sir Roderick's dead, even though we have no clue who that is. I think Bethesda has generally done a better job with stuff like this in Skyrim, although that can probably be attributed to more essential flags and less optional moments like meeting Sir Roderick. The way you fix this is to have a journal stage for whether the player has met Sir Roderick, and if they haven't, then Lathon's dialogue changes to an introduction and request for aid. He gives us the greaves that they had retrieved and tells us that Roderick fell attempting to retrieve the sword of the Crusader from under Paul Cave. This quest is just another dungeon run, but it's notable because it ends in us fighting Sir Beric, the man whose conflict with Sir Amiel ended the original Knights of the Nine. Sir Caius, one of the ghosts, says that Sir Beric's fall was his fault, as Caius had started and lost a fight with Beric, resulting in his death and corruption.
Sir Roderick, you were a brave knight and good master. Long may your name be remembered in the annals of the relics.
Yeah, sorry kid, let me introduce you to something called the Creation Club. When we get the sword, the player is given the instructions to take it to the Chapel of Arcane Shadenhall to reconsecrate the blade. Lathon or Beric or even the Spirit of Pelennor doesn't tell us this. The player just intuits it and writes it down in their journal as the next step. This is just a reference to divine influence on the mind, or it's just lazy. After all, we have to go to Shadenhall in order to defend its chapel from attacking Aurorans. I'll point out that similar to the Mages Guild questline where the Necromancers managed to sneak into Bruma and destroyed the guild hall without resistance or even notice from the guards, especially since my character at that point had brought Martin to a Cloud Ruler temple so the guards were on the lookout for cult activity, the chapels are actively being attacked without any of the guards putting up any resistance, in a post-Oblivion Crisis world where the guards aren't having to fight Daedra anymore. Hell, that raises the question of how the Aurorans are even getting here. The Aurorans, if you don't know, are Daedric minions of Meridia, as evidenced by the Daedric hearts they drop. We'll later be told that Martin's ban on Daedric invasions only applied to hostile invasions, but isn't this hostile? Or has Umaril been hiding in a ruin gradually doing permanent summons of Aurorans and building up a force for the day he would launch terror attacks across Cyrodiil? Another thing to note is the Restoration Master Trainer becomes inaccessible to the player after this quest if they don't have the unofficial patch, since both people who can give the player the necessary reference are scripted to die as part of this questline. Just to show how much thought Bethesda put into their trainer NPCs. With the sword purified, we have all the relics. Each of the artifacts belongs to one of the 8 divines, and in theory, each of these quests should have shown some of the lore behind these entities. The fact that the Cuirass and Greaves belong to either Mara or Akatosh says that this premise has failed, as most of the artifacts have a superficial connection to their respective creator at best. And even when we got a few detailed connections, it was something like Kenrith making us endure a couple swings from a bear, or Stendarr dishing out some Old Testament punishments for our benefit. Speaking of the curse, when we return to the Priory, we'll find that Wes Johnson has swung by to give a sermon to the Order. He gives the Knights of the Nine a quest to defeat Umaril. However, he states that in our current form will suffer the same fate as Pelennor Whitestrake.
With the apotheosis of Tiber Septim, the face of the divine was transformed. Talos ascended, and the 8 became 9.
Talos, via the Prophet, gives us his blessing, providing an edge against Umaril, although the Prophet has this funny line.
As a proven guardian of this realm, and a warrior the likes of which have not been seen in millennia, Talos grants you his sacred blessing.
The Champion of Cyrodiil, the Nerevarine, the Agent, and the Internal Champion are all literally shaking right now. For fuck's sake, the Nerevarine literally got a blessing from an avatar of Talos on his way to fight Dagoth. The Knight of the Nine did a bunch of dungeons and talked to a bunch of people and is now a warrior the likes of which have not been seen in millennia. Maybe it's a subtle diss. Or I guess all the other protagonists are confirmed mages, who knows. So we rally all the knights at Garlus Malatar for the final battle. This quest actually broke the first time, and I had to go back to a prior save because, for some reason, one of the triggers wasn't firing, and so I couldn't actually advance through the ruin. It's a shame they didn't reuse any of the assets from Paradise to make this area a more pristine, maintained alien ruin. I mean, the interior cell of Carrick-a-Gailor was one model, so I guess they would have had to create a bunch of new interior models, and that was just too much work. Plus, the DLC was 155 megabytes on 2006 internet, so adding a bunch of new models so one dungeon could stand out would have been wasteful. None of your companions are essential, so the player may be motivated to try and keep everyone alive, but there's not really any benefit to doing so. Honestly, it makes the game feel a little more believable if these named NPCs do end up dying in the fight. Aside from the compulsive looting, the final battle with Umaril is alright. The problem with making a final battle focused on the melee side of Oblivion is that it's more Oblivion melee combat. Mind you that this character has maxed out the heavy armor skill and was using Blade for the entire main quest. I'm basically primed for this. So Umaril fighting like a giant copy of the other Aurorans is pretty sad. Umaril is an Ayleid sorcerer king whose father was a divine, and he also has the blessing of Meridia. This guy is begging to be the battle mage boss and deserves to have more than one spell to his name. What's the point of even having him be weakened by the divine aura of the armor? Is it to reward the player for wearing the armor from Knights of the Nine when fighting the boss of Knights of the Nine?
All of this is to assemble every Crusader relic so we can go and kill Umaril. Except I forgot to bring most of these items with us to Umaril's hideout, so we had to fight him the conventional way.
Umaril goes down easy, and we use Talos' blessing to pursue his spirit. The second phase, where we fight him in the sky, is exactly the same mechanically, but the arena is way better and it's much more enjoyable to have a second go at him. With Umaril finally dead for good, we fall back to Tamriel and awaken in the Undercroft of the Priory.
You had no wounds on your body, but you were dead. I saw it with my own eyes. You did not draw breath.
Thedrit, how long has my brain been deprived of oxygen? Thedrit gives a short speech to the knights announcing our victory, and with the armor placed on the rack in the Undercroft, Knights of the Nine has been concluded. Or is it? There's one character left to mention. Pelennor Whitestrake, as the original Divine Crusader of the First Era, is both one of the main characters of Knights of the Nine and almost completely irrelevant. If your knowledge of this DLC was limited to Tez meme culture, you'd assume that Pelennor Whitestrake would have been the main focus of the entire story. Instead, the characters of the original Knights of the Nine like Sir Amiel and Sir Barrack got way more focus and screen time than Pelennor Whitestrake, and this is an order that was founded over a millennia after Pellennor's death. Indeed, most of the lore surrounding the Star-Made Knight exists pretty much entirely within the Song of Pelennor, an 8-part Kirkbride story that the player can find in the chapels when they have this expansion installed. Most of the dialogue the actual Pelennor Whitestrake we meet has refers to our quest for the relics, and he has little light to shine on himself beyond the line,
Your need must be great for the gods to allow us to speak. Has Umaril the Accursed found a way back? The foulest of a foul race. 1,000 curses upon his unholy name. I thought I'd won, but I should have known. The slave masters are a cunning breed. Umaril found a way to cheat death as I could not.
So let's discuss the Song of Pelennor. The first 6 parts come from a Riemann manuscript. Part 7 comes from an older manuscript predating the fall of the Elysian Empire, and Part 8 appears to contain a fragment of the original song. It goes something like this. Pelennor appeared, something immediately being apparently odd about his arrival. His personality, his phenotypical description, and his armor are big signifiers that he wasn't of that era. Theories vary, from possibly being a time traveler to being a manifestation of the divine will against the Aelids and their enslavement of mankind. When Pelennor Whitestrake gets depicted as a Terminator with a laser cannon, yeah, that's a valid interpretation according to the song. However, given that the Elder Scrolls' favorite trick in the lore is the unreliable narrator, it's also possible that Pelennor was just a normal guy with albinism who happened to be blessed by the Divines and won every battle he fought until the last one that killed him. That characterization is a lot closer to the man we see than the elvish Terminator people love to meme about. And for good reason. Elves aren't exactly given the most charitable of racial characterizations, especially in Oblivion where all of them share 2 voice actors. If you told me there was a guy out there wiping the smug off their faces, I'd ask for a link to his Patreon. This brings us to the concept of the Shezarene. Shezar was the Cyrodiilic version of Lorkhan to the Elves and Shor to the Nords. It's generally believed that Lorkhan, since his supposed death, has been wandering Tamriel in various mortal incarnations. Some of these are substantiated by the lore, but a lot of this comes down to Kirkbride-isms as probably a future plot point, potentially even for Skyrim, that has yet to really make the cut due to the series stalling in the 2010s. It's disappointing to me that Kirkbride wasn't really given the time to fully flesh out the history of Cyrodiil's various empires. He tries his best. We get quite a bit more content on the Aelids and their history and culture. We also learn more about Elysia and Morahouse, like how despite all the man statues and man armor, Morahouse was actually a minotaur. It's just a shame that pretty much none of this is actually conveyed to the player through the questline itself. I'm not going to offer a redraft because that would require a foundational restart on Knights of the Nine. Instead, I'll do what I'm best at, tearing stuff down by making unfair comparisons. Knights of the Nine sits in the same position as Tribunal and Dawnguard as the story expansions of their respective games, but how do they compare? Tribunal featured a 19-part questline that tied up the fate of the Tribunal and King Helseth, leader of Morrowind. This wasn't like Knights of the Nine, which stretched out quests into multiple parts, like how the Faithful Squire is literally a single conversation. Tribunal's quest actually raises the bar from Morrowind, while Knights of the Nine rolled around in the mediocrity of Oblivion. Knights of the Nine is also set in Cyrodiil, unlike Tribunal's new locale of the city of Mournhold. Dawnguard would continue this trend, basically taking place in a few hidden parts of broader Skyrim. Although Dawnguard would also provide 2 exclusive questlines and factions to choose from, a rework of werewolves and vampires, and new areas like the Soul Cairn and Forgotten Vale. I mean, sure, it's not fair to compare Knights of the Nine to a DLC that would come out half a decade later, but it is fair to say that Knights of the Nine didn't do for Oblivion what Dawnguard did for Skyrim. That wouldn't happen until Shivering Isles, which is a ways away in this video. What's going to be a forever away is the Holidays DLC.
One of the towns will have Jester Day. So on Jester Day, you can go to town and all the crimes in the town are 50% off. So you get caught doing a crime and a guard comes to arrest you, you pay half as much as you normally would because it's kind of everybody screwing around being a goof all day. So